Another a tip for doing these wax ups is when you're shaping it and detailing it, a good way to get them smooth is to use one of these gas soldering irons, but you change the tip and put there's sort of a mini heat gun or blowtorch tip you can add to these, and it's really good for just putting a sheen on the wax. And I'll show you. Self-ignite, just wait for a moment for it to heat up, but you just gently run it over the surface and it just melts the surface layer, and you lose any of your little tool marks and puts a nice sheen on it. The other thing you can do to texture these is when you've softened the surface with this little gas flame is to then press sandpaper, abrasive paper, into the surface and pull it away, and it leaves that rough texture that the roots have. I'm just working my way over and it just brings it up really nicely. Any bubbles that are under the surface will come up to the surface and pop, and they might leave little pits in the surface, so you just heat up the end of your knife and just put them in the little hole and it'll melt the wax and fill it in. You don't have to have one of these, and in fact just by rubbing with a cloth on the surface of the wax you can get a pretty good finish. There we go. This is the finished, well, the wax up's finished for this tooth. I'm happy with that. I actually redid it a couple of times because I wasn't quite happy, but it looks good now. I've got the proportion right. If I aim that at the camera, you can see the root contour is even, and if looking at you look at the angle of this, and just all sorts. Just keep looking at it, make sure it looks right. Now, if I hold it, I don't know if you can see the detail on this. See if I can focus it. You see the enamel part shiny and the root part I've textured, so that's rough. Yeah, try and get it shining a bit more, but that's it. The next thing to do is to make a mould housing. There's different ways of doing this. You could put the whole thing in a mould, bury the whole tooth and then dig the tooth out and put the tooth back in. But what I tend to do is make a housing that just houses the part of the tooth that I need it to. This is a mould housing I've made for a previous tooth. I'm actually going to reuse it for this tooth because it fits. It looks a bit complicated, but it's not. It's if I just undo this, what we're looking at is a box. One side is perspex or clear acrylic sheet, so you can see what you're doing, and that's all glued to these blocks of wood using a glue gun, which is your mould maker's best friend really, a glue gun. It's rock solid, it seals it and it's set straight away. So I make the three sides out of wood, like I say, with a glue gun. I use a hardwood ash because it means you can screw into it very nicely. So this is the fixed side. We then have the other side, which is wood, and that screws onto there, and you screw that down. It's important to have one side removable because when you come to take the tooth out, you need to take this side off, remove the silicone, peel the tooth out, and then when you put the tooth back into the mould and screw it all back up, it holds it all firm and tight and seals it properly. You could make this side out of clear acrylic, but it does have a tendency to crack when you screw it up tight and screw and drill through it. So wood, you can put a bit more pressure on wood, it's nice and rigid. I'll show you how it looks with the tooth in. I'll take the side off for this. I'll just carefully position this in here without damaging the wax, and it sits in like that. So the wax part hangs down into the mould housing, and what we'll do is this side will then be screwed on. I'll fix this in place. I use a little bit of sort of impression putty. It's a fast setting putty just to hold these in place, but you could just run tape over the top of the mould just to hold the tooth in place. So you screw the side on the mould, fix the tooth in the correct position, and then we pour the silicone in the top so it gradually fills up the mould up to there. Well, I'll show you what they look like when I pour the moulds, but that just gives you an idea about how we're doing it. You can bury the whole tooth, you can build a much bigger mould housing. The reason I'm doing this is to keep, so I'm not using too much silicone. It's quite expensive, liquid silicone, mould making silicone. It's so these are a single use mould. These are all one-offs. You're not going to reuse the mould, so you don't really want to be spending lots of money buying silicone rubber that you're going to throw away afterwards. So I just do this on being tight, really. It's just I'll get a good quality mould using a minimum amount of silicone. The silicone I use is a condensation cured silicone. It's about the best value silicone you can buy. It's very runny, it degasses itself quite nicely, and it produces a really good mould. It's got a good working time. The other thing I'll just show you is the other tooth. This one is all in its mould ready to go. So you can just see the tooth through the side there. I had to modify this mould. It was a little bit too small, so I've had to sort of cobble it together. You can see the putty I've used just to hold the tooth in place. I will put a piece of tape across here as well, just to ensure it doesn't move. But there we are, that's it. And that's from the other side. All ready to have the silicone poured in. This is the silicone I'm going to use. Polygraph general purpose RTV silicone rubber, and as I say, it's a condensation cured silicone. It's a two-part silicone, so you get the base and then you get the catalyst, and it's just check the details. It's a mix ratio of 10:1 for this. And it's really important, that's by weight. It's really important to follow the manufacturer's guidelines when you're mixing your silicone. Mix it really thoroughly. Make sure that it's all a uniform colour, no streaks. You can pour it from one bowl into another to ensure that there's no unmixed stuff left on the side of the first bowl, which is what they suggest. This is the fairly standard catalyst I've got with this one. They do a faster catalyst, faster set one, but to be honest, I prefer the longer working time. I'd rather not be rushed. You might decide you would, get the quicker one, but really, I don't mind waiting. It does take a while to set. I leave this a good 24 hours before demoulding, just to make sure it's completely set. I get most of my mould making stuff, the silicone, the bronze and the polyester resin, I get it all from mbfg.co.uk. They're really good value. They offer good very fast delivery, very reliable. Been very impressed with them. If you're watching this is in the UK, hence the .co.uk. I think you've probably got a lot more choice if you're in the States and watching this, but over here not quite so much choice, but as I say, mbfg.co.uk sell everything you could possibly want, really. And this one is the best value. It's a really high quality silicone for the money. It's still it works out quite expensive, which is why I make the mould housing as small as possible, because I don't want to waste this stuff. And as I say, it's a single use mould. It's not like you're going to be using it to cast lots and lots of repeat items. It's single use. You're going to bin it once you've done your tooth. Quick word on mould preparation, or the housing for the mould. I Vaseline the insides, especially the wood surfaces, because they are slightly porous and you don't want the silicone absorbing into it. And the other thing is, if you see this little bead of putty I've put around there, that's plumber's mate, which is a non-setting putty, which is used by plumbers for making seals in pipes, waste pipes and things like that. And it means that you can actually undo the pipes at a later date. It doesn't set like silicone does. So I use a bit of plumber's mate and run that around to form the seal. The other side is sealed by the glue gun. But we then line up the screws. Just screw those down. So that's all sealed. You see there's a little bead of the plumber's mate oozed out. Tends to just run a finger around the sides just to get rid of that. But it shows it's sealed. If it's oozed out around the sides, you know you've got a good seal. There we are. And that's all ready to go. I won't bore you on mixing of silicone, because all silicones are different. You have to mix them different ways. Just make sure you're ready. Have your mixing bowls ready. Have your scales ready. Have your moulds all ready to go. Make sure you've got everything together. Make sure you know how much you're going to be mixing out. Make sure you're accurate with your weights. Decent mixing spatulas are worth getting, because this stuff is quite hard work to mix, really, and you want to do it thoroughly. I worked out how much silicone I would need. I actually measured the moulds and worked it out roughly, but you could fill them with water and tip the water into the bowl and then mark on the side. So you leave a mark where you're going to fill up to. You put that on the scales, fill up to the mark, and then work out how much of your catalyst you need. And with this one it's easy because it's 10 to 1, so very simple to work out. Okay, what I'll do is I'll show you once I've actually poured the moulds, once I've poured them in. This is the, it's all poured up and set now, 24 hours later. I've unscrewed this side so it exposes the mould. I've got to lift this out. There we are. Put that to one side. And I've got to gently peel the tooth out. The tooth, just got to get the wax is separated, so just got to get the wax out. That's out. Got to hang on to that bit because we need to work out the volume of that, so we mix the right amount of bronze resin. I'll put that to one side. And there's the mould. We're going to have to reinsert the tooth into that when we add the bronze. Okay, once you got the tooth out of the mould, clean up the tooth, get rid of any wax, get rid of any silicone that may be on the tooth. The silicone sometimes creeps under the wax and can creep quite a long way under, so peel all that off, get rid of anything like that. As I say, hang on to the piece of wax because you need to work out the volume of that so you know how much resin to mix up. And you just do that by measuring displacement of water in a little small measuring thing. Next thing you do, get the mould, the silicone bit. I cut around the edges so you've got quite a neat edge to the mould rather than a feathery edge. That way you can make sure your tooth is properly seating back into it. And any little tags inside, get hold of a pair of tweezers, pull them, and then use a sharp scalpel just to snip off any little tags that might be there, because they won't locate well back into the tooth. The other thing you need to do, you've got to create, the way I pour these up is I invert them with the tooth in there and it all clamped in, and I pour the resin into this bit. So this will be the missing part, and I'll be pouring the resin into this void that is left by the wax. So what I'm going to do is look for the highest point, this point inside the mould, and I'm going to cut through into that. So what I do, use a needle, and I carefully work out where it is, and I can use this as a guide as well. You could actually build a little wax sprue on this before you make the mould. It doesn't really make a lot of odds, it's quite easy doing this. So I push a point through so I know we're in the right place. Then use a really sharp scalpel blade, and I cut around the needle in a conical shape. So pull the needle out. As you can see, you've got a little cone there, and that's going to be where I pour the resin into, the bronze resin. So I'm just going to enlarge that a little bit. There's my little entry hole, and that takes you through. I'll just show you into the bottom of that. You can just see where that comes out the other side, and that goes. So this will be the housing, which I poured it that way up to get the mould. Now when we're going to turn it over with this inside and the tooth, you can see I've got to re-drill this hole in the bottom. That's the entry port for my resin. So I've got to position the tooth inside this, put this inside that. That's what these legs are, because it's going to stand inverted while I pour the resin.